The breakups that became eras. There is a strange thing about Taylor Swift's love life. The world has spent years trying to figure out who broke her heart. But Taylor Swift has spent even longer turning those heartbreaks into songs. A phone call that lasted less than half a minute. A relationship that ended because one person wasn't ready. A birthday party where someone never showed up. A vacation that ended with Taylor leaving alone. A public relationship that collapsed under the weight of the spotlight. And eventually, a 6-year romance that seemed destined to become permanent, until suddenly, it wasn't. For years, fans have tried to connect the dots between Taylor's relationships and the songs that followed them. Sometimes Taylor herself made those connections obvious. Other times, fans were left decoding lyrics, timelines, interviews, music videos, and tiny details that seemed almost impossible to notice. But there's one thing that makes Taylor's breakup history different from almost any other pop stars. She didn't just survive heartbreak. She documented it. She turned embarrassment into lyrics. She turned anger into melodies. She turned nostalgia into entire albums. And sometimes, years after a relationship ended, she returned to the story with an entirely different perspective. That's why looking back at Taylor's relationships isn't simply a list of famous ex-boyfriends. It's a timeline of how Taylor changed. Because the Taylor who experienced her first very public breakup was not the same Taylor who eventually learned to protect her private life. And the Taylor who once publicly joked about a 27-second phone call eventually became someone who could spend 6 years in a relationship almost completely outside the spotlight. So today, we're going back through the relationships, the breakups, the songs, the misunderstandings, and the moments that fans believe shaped some of Taylor Swift's most unforgettable music. And some of these stories are much more complicated than the headlines made them seem. If you're a Swiftie who loves looking beyond the headline and following Taylor's story from one era to the next, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Taylor Timeline, because we're going through the moments that helped shape the music, the memories, and the Taylor Swift story fans still talk about today. And we're starting with the breakup that became one of the earliest chapters in the Taylor Swift mythology. Joe Jonas and the 27-second phone call. Back in 2008, Taylor Swift was only 18 years old. She was already becoming one of the biggest young stars in country music, but she was still incredibly young, and her personal life was beginning to attract the same attention as her career. That year, she dated Joe Jonas. The relationship was brief, but the breakup became enormous. Taylor later described Joe ending the relationship during a phone call that she said lasted approximately 27 seconds. That detail became part of pop culture history. And Taylor didn't exactly hide how hurt she was. The story became even more memorable because Taylor later discussed the breakup publicly, including during an appearance on The Ellen DeGeneres Show. She joked about how quickly the relationship had ended, and at the time, the moment became another example of young Taylor turning personal heartbreak into public storytelling. But the interesting part is what happened years later. Taylor eventually looked back at that period differently. In 2019, she admitted that publicly putting Joe on blast had been immature. That admission matters. Because it's easy to look at Taylor's early breakup songs and see only revenge, anger, or teenage drama. But Taylor herself eventually recognized that she had grown. Joe did too. Years later, the two were no longer publicly locked in an old feud. They became friendly. And that evolution is important because Taylor's relationship with Joe demonstrates something that would become a recurring theme throughout her career. The song may last forever. The anger doesn't necessarily have to. Taylor also referenced Joe's family in later work, most notably in Invisible String, which fans connected to the idea of her past relationships eventually becoming part of a much larger life story. And that's one of the fascinating things about Taylor's catalog. A person can be the villain in one song and part of a peaceful memory years later. But Joe Jonas wasn't the only early relationship that Taylor later examined through music. Because what came next involved a different kind of heartbreak. One where Taylor eventually admitted that she was the one who had been careless. Taylor Lautner and the apology hidden in a song. In 2009, Taylor Swift starred alongside Taylor Lautner in Valentine's Day. The two Taylors' relationship quickly became a major pop culture story. They were young. They were famous. They were filming a movie together. And suddenly, they were also dating. But the relationship didn't last long. And years later, Taylor Swift described the situation in a surprisingly self-critical way. While discussing the song, Back to December, Taylor explained that it was about someone who had treated her extremely well, while she had been careless with him. That was a very different kind of breakup song. It wasn't about exposing an ex. It wasn't about humiliating someone. It was an apology. Taylor was essentially looking backward and admitting that she hadn't handled the relationship properly. And that distinction becomes important when you look at Taylor's evolution as a songwriter. Early Taylor often wrote from the perspective of the person who had been hurt. But, Back to December, showed something more complicated. Sometimes Taylor was willing to admit, "I hurt someone too." That kind of self-awareness became increasingly important in her later work. And Taylor Lautner himself eventually became part of Taylor's story again. Years later, he appeared in Taylor's I Can See You music video and joined her on stage during the Eras tour. That moment was almost surreal. Because the young couple who had once been tabloid news had eventually reached a point where the old relationship could simply become part of the past. No dramatic feud. No public war. Just two people who had grown up. And that is one of the most overlooked lessons in Taylor's relationship timeline. Not every breakup has to end with hatred. Sometimes the person who once inspired a heartbreak song eventually becomes someone you can laugh with. But the next relationship was very different. Because Taylor wasn't simply dating a fellow young star. She was dating someone she had admired for years. And the emotional consequences would become much more intense. John Mayer and the relationship that became Dear John. Taylor Swift's relationship with John Mayer remains one of the most discussed chapters of her early career. They collaborated musically, and Taylor had publicly admired Mayer's work. But the relationship itself was short-lived. Taylor was young. Mayer was significantly older. And years later, Taylor released one of the most pointed songs in her catalog, Dear John. Taylor never needed to say a name in the song for fans to immediately begin connecting the dots. And Mayer himself later publicly discussed the song and expressed that he felt humiliated by it. Taylor, meanwhile, used the song to describe what she portrayed as a deeply painful relationship. The important distinction here is that a song can represent an artist's perspective without giving us access to every private detail of a relationship. We don't know every conversation that happened behind closed doors. We don't know every disagreement. We only know what Taylor chose to communicate through her music and public comments. And that is something worth remembering whenever fans attempt to reconstruct her relationships. A Taylor Swift song can be emotionally revealing without functioning as a complete legal transcript of what happened. Still, Dear John became a turning point. Because Taylor was beginning to understand that songwriting gave her a way to process experiences that she couldn't, or didn't want to, explain directly. And the next relationship would produce perhaps the most famous heartbreak album of her career. Jake Gyllenhaal and the heartbreak of Red. Then came Jake Gyllenhaal. Taylor and Jake were linked in late 2010, and their relationship lasted only a few months. But its impact on Taylor's music was enormous. The relationship became intensely scrutinized because of the age difference and because Taylor was still very young. Then came the songs. All Too Well. The Moment I Knew. We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together. And eventually, the expanded version of All Too Well. This was no longer simply Taylor writing a breakup song. This was Taylor building an entire emotional universe around a relationship. All Too Well became famous for its details. The memories. The arguments. The sense of losing something that once felt real. And then there was the birthday. Taylor later described one birthday as an especially painful moment because the person she expected to be there did not show up. That experience became closely associated with The Moment I Knew. And when fans listen to the song, the emotional devastation isn't really about the party itself. It's about what the absence represented. The realization that something had changed. Sometimes the breakup doesn't happen when someone says, "We're done." Sometimes the breakup happens emotionally first. A person stops showing up. Stops trying. Stops making you feel chosen. And suddenly, the relationship you thought you were inside no longer feels like the relationship you remember. That's why The Moment I Knew remains so painful. But All Too Well took the story even further. Years later, Taylor revisited it with All Too Well, the short film. The short film transformed the relationship into a visual story about an age gap romance, emotional distance, and the painful process of realizing that two people aren't experiencing the relationship in the same way. And then came one of the most debated details in the entire Taylor Swift catalog: the scarf. Fans spent years trying to figure out exactly what the red scarf represented. Taylor has played coy when asked about it. And that ambiguity is part of why the object became such a massive piece of Swiftie mythology. The scarf became bigger than an accessory. It became a symbol of memory, a symbol of intimacy, a symbol of something left behind. And perhaps most importantly, a symbol of the way Taylor Swift can take an ordinary object and turn it into emotional mythology. But there was another relationship that showed a completely different side of Taylor. One involving one of America's most famous political families. Connor Kennedy, and the summer of 2012. In 2012, Taylor Swift was linked to Connor Kennedy. The relationship lasted only a few months, but it became a major celebrity story because of the Kennedy family's legendary place in American culture. Taylor spent time around the Kennedy family, and the relationship attracted intense attention. One of the most talked-about stories involved a Kennedy family wedding. Reports at the time claimed there was disagreement over whether Taylor should attend, and accounts differed over exactly what happened. According to those reports, Taylor and Connor ultimately attended the wedding-related event despite concerns from family members and were asked to leave. This is an important place to slow down. Because years later, the story has often been repeated online as though every detail is universally established fact. It isn't. There were contemporary reports and competing accounts surrounding the incident. So the safest way to understand the episode is as a highly publicized disagreement surrounding Taylor's presence at a private family event. The relationship ended shortly afterward, and Taylor eventually drew creative inspiration from the Kennedy world for Starlight. The song wasn't simply a breakup track. It was romantic, dreamy, nostalgic. It captured the fascination Taylor had with the mythology surrounding the Kennedy family. But by the end of 2012, Taylor was about to enter one of the most internationally photographed relationships of her career. Because this time, the other half of the couple was Harry Styles. And almost immediately, the world was watching. Harry Styles, The Boat, and a relationship under a microscope. Taylor Swift and Harry Styles. Even saying those names together instantly brings back an entire era of pop culture. They were young. They were globally famous. And they were photographed constantly. The relationship began in late 2012 and lasted only a few months. But the amount of attention surrounding them made it feel much larger. Suddenly, every photograph mattered. Every trip mattered. Every facial expression mattered. Every person standing near them could become part of the story. And that level of scrutiny can put enormous pressure on any young relationship. Taylor's music from that era contains several references fans have connected to Harry. Songs such as Style and Out of the Woods became central to fan theories about the relationship. And then there was the image. Taylor leaving a vacation destination alone. The blue dress. The boat. The photographs. The visual became one of the defining images of the relationship's end. But what makes this chapter particularly interesting is that Taylor didn't simply write about being angry. She wrote about uncertainty, about danger, about wondering whether a relationship could survive. And Out of the Woods captures that feeling beautifully. It isn't a simple breakup song. It's the sound of someone asking whether the relationship is ever going to become safe, whether they're finally going to make it through the chaos, whether the next crisis is already waiting. That became increasingly relevant to Taylor's life as her fame grew. Because the more famous she became, the harder it was to have a normal relationship. And that brings us to Calvin Harris. For a while, Taylor appeared to have found something different. Something longer. Something quieter. And then one song changed everything. Calvin Harris and the song that changed the conversation. Taylor Swift and Calvin Harris dated for roughly 15 months. Compared with several of Taylor's earlier relationships, that was a significant amount of time. And publicly, the relationship looked very different. They attended events together. They traveled. They appeared comfortable with each other. For a period, it seemed like Taylor had found a relationship that could exist alongside her increasingly enormous career. But then came, This Is What You Came For. The song became a major hit for Calvin Harris and Rihanna. And eventually, reports emerged that Taylor had contributed to the songwriting under the pseudonym Nils Sjoberg. Taylor's involvement became public. Harris then acknowledged that Taylor had written and contributed vocals to the song, but he also criticized the way the story was handled publicly. The resulting exchange became one of the messiest public moments of their relationship. And this is where the story becomes less about romance and more about professional identity. Taylor Swift wasn't simply someone's girlfriend. She was a songwriter, a producer, a creator, and someone whose work was deeply connected to her identity. Questions about who received credit were therefore not trivial. They were connected to Taylor's creative ownership. The relationship ended around this period. And once again, a breakup became part of a larger Taylor Swift narrative. But Taylor's next relationship would be dramatically different. Because almost immediately after her split with Calvin, Taylor became involved with another man who represented a completely different kind of relationship. Tom Hiddleston. Tom Hiddleston and the romance that burned too bright. Taylor met Tom Hiddleston around the time of the 2016 Met Gala. Their dance became famous. And within weeks, photographs of the new couple seemed to be everywhere. Taylor and Tom were photographed together in Rhode Island. They traveled. They met family members. And Tom famously wore an I Heart Suit TS shirt. It was the kind of celebrity romance that tabloids could build an entire summer around. But it didn't last. The relationship ended after only a few months. And one interpretation of the breakup is that the public nature of the romance became part of the problem. Taylor had just come out of a highly public relationship. Her life was already under enormous scrutiny. And she was also beginning a relationship with someone who would eventually become extremely important to her, Joe Alwyn. This is where Taylor's story becomes especially interesting. Because the 2016 period wasn't simply about Tom. It was also about the beginning of the relationship that would dominate the next 6 years of her life. Taylor's sixth studio album, Reputation, later gave fans a completely different picture of her personal world. Instead of public declarations, there was secrecy. Instead of constant photographs, there was privacy. Instead of feeding the media machine, Taylor appeared determined to step away from it. And Joe Alwyn became central to that transformation. Joe Alwyn and the 6-year chapter. Taylor Swift and Joe Alwyn were together for approximately 6 years. That alone made the relationship different from almost everything that came before it. But the biggest difference was privacy. Taylor had learned what happened when the public became too deeply involved in her relationships. So with Joe, she protected the relationship. They rarely appeared together publicly. They didn't constantly give interviews about each other. They kept the details of their relationship largely away from the public. And Joe became part of Taylor's music in a way that was unusually intimate. He co-wrote songs with her under the pseudonym William Bowery. Their creative collaboration became part of the story. And during this period, Taylor released some of the most critically acclaimed music of her career. Albums like Folklore and Evermore demonstrated how much Taylor had evolved as a writer. But eventually, even the most private relationship can reach a breaking point. In April 2023, reports emerged that Taylor and Joe had separated. Reports described the breakup as amicable and pointed to differences in personality and lifestyle, including the pressures associated with Taylor's extraordinary level of fame. That explanation is important because it doesn't require a villain. Sometimes two people simply grow in different directions. Sometimes one person is comfortable with a quiet life while the other is living an existence that has become almost impossible to keep small. And Taylor's life had changed dramatically during those 6 years. She wasn't the same artist who had entered the relationship. She had become one of the most powerful figures in entertainment. Her career had expanded. Her audience had grown. Her public profile had reached an entirely different level. And after the breakup, Taylor's music on the Tortured Poets department invited fans to revisit the emotional aftermath of that period. But there is something important here. Fans can interpret lyrics. They can connect timelines. They can recognize themes. But they cannot know every private detail of Taylor's relationship unless Taylor herself confirms it. That's especially important with songs that seem to reference multiple people or multiple periods of her life. And then came the chapter that caused perhaps the most intense reaction from Swifties in years. Matty Healy. Matty Healy and the relationship fans didn't expect after Taylor's split from Joe Alwyn, She was linked to Matty Healy of the 1975. The two had known each other for years, and their history had been discussed by fans long before they were publicly linked. But when they appeared to become involved in 2023, the reaction was immediate. And it was not universally positive. Healy had a history of controversial public comments and behavior that had already attracted criticism. That meant Taylor's connection with him was immediately viewed through a much larger cultural conversation. Fans debated it intensely. Some defended Taylor's right to make her own choices. Others were deeply uncomfortable with the relationship. And once again, Taylor's personal life became a public referendum. The relationship itself was brief. But its emotional aftermath became much more significant in Taylor's songwriting. When the Tortured Poets department arrived, fans began searching through the lyrics for clues. Some songs appeared, at least to listeners, to explore themes of obsession, fantasy, disappointment, betrayal, and emotional instability. Guilty as Sin became particularly fascinating to fans because of its exploration of desire and fantasy. But interpreting a song as a direct factual account of a relationship can be dangerous. Taylor is an artist. She blends memories, imagination, metaphor, character, and emotion. Sometimes the person who inspired a song may not be the only subject of the song. Sometimes a lyric is intentionally ambiguous. And sometimes fans will never know exactly what happened. But there is one thing that became clear: the Matty chapter ended quickly. And the emotional reaction surrounding it was enormous. Some fans believe songs such as "The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived" reflect the anger and betrayal Taylor experienced after the relationship ended. But again, the interpretation belongs to the listener unless Taylor explicitly confirms it. What we do know is that the chapter became part of the emotional landscape of the Tortured Poets department. And then something unexpected happened. Taylor's romantic story moved in a direction nobody could have predicted. Because suddenly, there was Travis Kelce. And then came Travis Kelce in 2023. Taylor Swift's relationship timeline entered an entirely new era. Travis Kelce. At first, it sounded almost like the setup for a celebrity joke. A global pop superstar. An NFL tight end. Two enormous public figures from completely different worlds. But the relationship developed into something much bigger. Travis had publicly talked about wanting to meet Taylor after attending one of her era's tour shows. Taylor later described how his attempt to meet her had caught her attention. And once they began spending time together, the story exploded. But here's what made the Travis chapter different from so many of Taylor's previous relationships. Taylor didn't seem to be running away from visibility. She walked into it. She began appearing at Kansas City Chiefs games. Travis attended Taylor's shows. Their families and friends became part of the wider picture. And instead of Taylor trying to separate her relationship from her public life completely, the two seemed increasingly comfortable allowing fans to see parts of it. That doesn't mean the public knows everything. It doesn't. But the contrast with the Joe Alwyn era was striking. For 6 years, Taylor had protected a relationship through privacy. With Travis, she appeared to embrace a relationship that existed openly in the middle of an enormous cultural spotlight. And that difference tells us something important about Taylor's growth. The question is no longer simply, who is Taylor Swift dating? The more interesting question is, what has Taylor learned about relationships since she was 18? Because when you place all these chapters next to each other, a pattern begins to emerge. What Taylor's breakups really tell us: look at the timeline. Joe Jonas, Taylor Lautner, John Mayer, Jake Gyllenhaal, Connor Kennedy, Harry Styles, Calvin Harris, Tom Hiddleston, Joe Alwyn, Matty Healy, and now Travis Kelce. Every relationship was different. Every breakup had different circumstances. And not every famous theory about these relationships is necessarily true. But the music reveals something fascinating. Taylor's songwriting evolved alongside her relationships. Early Taylor was often trying to understand heartbreak. Then she became interested in self-reflection. Then anger. Then nostalgia. Then privacy. Then adulthood. And eventually, a more complicated understanding of love. The biggest mistake people make when discussing Taylor's breakup songs is assuming that the goal was revenge. Sometimes it was. But often, the goal was understanding. Taylor has repeatedly used songwriting as a way to make sense of experiences that were emotionally complicated. A breakup isn't simply, "we broke up." It's, "why did we break up? When did it actually end? Was it already over before either of us admitted it? What did I do wrong? What did they do wrong? What do I still miss? What am I angry about? What do I regret? What do I wish had happened differently?" And perhaps the most Taylor Swift question of all, can I turn this pain into something beautiful? The answer, over and over again, has been yes. The biggest change wasn't a boyfriend. There is another story hiding underneath all of this. And it has nothing to do with which boyfriend was right or wrong. Taylor herself changed. At 18, she was publicly discussing a 27-second breakup. At 20, she was writing intensely personal songs about heartbreak. At 22, she was living a highly visible celebrity romance. By her mid-20s, she had experienced relationships that became global entertainment news. Then came Alwyn. Privacy. 6 years. A much quieter personal life. And eventually, another transformation. Taylor no longer appeared to be the same young woman who had once felt compelled to explain everything. She had become much more comfortable allowing ambiguity to exist. And that might be the most important lesson in the entire timeline. Taylor didn't stop writing about relationships. She simply became better at controlling how much of the relationship belonged to the public. That's a major difference. Because fame teaches celebrities a strange lesson. The more you explain, the more people want to know. The more you reveal, the more people analyze. The more personal you become, the more the public can feel entitled to your private life. Taylor has spent years navigating that balance. And her songwriting became the compromise. She could tell the emotional truth without necessarily telling the entire factual story. That distinction is one reason her songs continue to resonate with millions of people. Because listeners don't need to have dated a famous actor. They don't need to have broken up with an NFL star. They don't need to have lived in a celebrity bubble. They just need to know what it feels like to lose someone. To regret something. To miss someone. To realize you stayed too long. To realize you left too soon. To wonder whether the person you loved ever understood how much you cared. That's why Taylor's breakup songs became bigger than Taylor's relationships. They became other people's memories too. The details fans still debate, and of course, Swifties are going to keep decoding. Was this song about Jake? Was that lyric about Joe? Did this line reference Harry? Was this character inspired by Matty? Was this actually about Alwyn? Could this particular lyric be about someone else entirely? Taylor has sometimes confirmed connections. Other times, she's deliberately left fans guessing. And that's part of the fun. But there is a line between interpretation and certainty. A fan theory can be fascinating without becoming fact. A lyric can remind listeners of a specific relationship without proving exactly what happened. And when dealing with real people, especially people who have never publicly confirmed every detail of a relationship, that distinction matters. The most interesting Taylor Swift stories aren't necessarily the ones where we pretend to know everything. Sometimes they're the stories where we recognize that there are pieces we'll never know. Because Taylor's music belongs to her. She decides what becomes public. She decides what stays private. And she decides which memories become songs. Why Swifties keep coming back to these stories? So why do fans still care about breakups that happened more than a decade ago? Why does a 27-second phone call still get mentioned? Why does everyone know about the scarf? Why does All Too Well continue to generate conversations years after the relationship that inspired it ended? Why do fans still debate the meaning behind songs from Reputation, Folklore, Evermore, Midnights, and the Tortured Poets Department? Because Taylor has created something rare. She didn't simply write songs about her life. She created a musical archive of growing up. Fans grew up alongside her. Someone who listened to Fearless as a teenager might have heard Red during their first serious breakup. Someone who discovered Taylor through 1989 might have later experienced their own relationship while listening to Reputation. Someone who listened to Folklore during a difficult period may now hear those songs completely differently years later. That's the secret. The songs change because the listener changes. And Taylor's own relationship history becomes part of that larger emotional timeline. The breakup isn't the ending. It's the chapter that eventually becomes a song. And the song becomes a memory. And the memory becomes part of someone's life. From Heartbreak to Something Different, Taylor Swift's relationship history is often presented as a list of men. But that misses the bigger story. The real story is Taylor learning what she wants. Learning what she doesn't want. Learning when to apologize. Learning when to walk away. Learning when privacy matters. Learning how much fame can affect intimacy. Learning that love can be exciting and complicated at the same time. And perhaps most importantly, learning that a relationship ending doesn't mean the experience was meaningless. Jonas became part of her early songwriting history. Taylor Lautner became part of a song about regret. John Mayer became part of one of her most pointed songs. Jake Gyllenhaal became connected to one of the most celebrated songs in modern pop music. Harry Styles became part of an entire era of uncertainty and young love. Calvin Harris became part of a story about creative credit and professional identity. Tom Hiddleston became part of the transition toward privacy. Alwyn became part of a 6-year chapter that fundamentally changed how Taylor approached her private life. Matty Healy became part of one of her most emotionally complicated recent musical periods. And Travis Kelce represents something that Taylor's earlier relationships couldn't have predicted, a relationship that unfolded while Taylor was already at the absolute height of her fame. That's the remarkable part. Taylor isn't the same person who experienced these breakups. And maybe that's why she keeps revisiting them. Because when you look backward, you're not just remembering the person you loved. You're remembering the person you were. The final chapter is still being written, and that brings us back to where we started. The question isn't really, who broke Taylor Swift's heart? Because Taylor has had heartbreak. She has also caused heartbreak. She has made mistakes. She's admitted them. She's written about them. She's turned them into songs. And she's grown. That's what makes the timeline so fascinating. The girl who once publicly joked about a 27-second breakup eventually became a woman capable of protecting 6 years of love from the public. The artist who once wrote extremely direct songs about specific heartbreaks eventually became someone who could hide entire layers of meaning behind metaphor, fictional characters, and carefully chosen details. And the superstar who once seemed unable to escape the scrutiny surrounding her relationships eventually learned how to live inside that scrutiny without allowing it to define everything. Now, with Travis Kelce, Taylor's story has entered another chapter. And whether that chapter lasts years, changes unexpectedly, or simply becomes another piece of her larger life story, one thing is certain: Taylor Swift will probably keep writing. Because that's what she's always done. She takes the moments that hurt, the moments that confuse her, the moments she regrets, the moments she can't forget, and she turns them into something that millions of people can recognize as their own. Maybe that's why Swifties don't just listen to Taylor Swift. They remember with her. A lyric becomes a photograph. A melody becomes a summer. An album becomes a relationship. And eventually, a breakup becomes a story that no longer belongs only to the person who lived it. It belongs to everyone who found themselves inside the song. So perhaps the most beautiful thing about Taylor's breakup timeline isn't who she dated. It's who she became after each chapter ended. Because every relationship left something behind. A lesson. A song. A memory. A version of Taylor that existed for a little while before she became someone new. And whatever comes next, that is the part Swifties will continue watching. Not just who Taylor loves, but who Taylor becomes. This is Taylor Timeline. And if you love following every era, every lyric, every unexpected chapter, and every story behind the music, make sure you're subscribed. Because Taylor's timeline isn't finished. Not even close.